people have to pull that out, which is distinguished professor Bob Aller. People are still coming in. And well, you know, there's a lot you can say. I'm just gonna, you know, start with, you know, the usual. He has a bachelor's in chemistry and in biology and geology from the University of Rochester. Then he went to Yale, where he was in the Department of Geology and Geophysics. He got a PhD in 1977. Went to Chicago at some point, where he was for a few years, and then in 1986, right?
10 years.
10 years. So in 1986, he came to Stony Brook University, and luckily he's been here ever since. He has a bunch of like honorary, you call it, like doctors from Sweden and France, and he's a fellow of APU, he's a fellow of the Geochemical Society. He actually won the American Chemical Society Geochemistry Division Medal. He also has a few Stony Brook University awards, a Provost Outstanding Mentor Award, the University Senate Leadership Award. You didn't put on your CV how long you've been on the University Senate, but I know you've been very involved there too. So that's, I think, something, you know, we should mention, because he's putting in a good word for there, for us there for a long time. You know, from the publication side, he's almost up to 200 publications, 26,000 citations. But, you know, on a more personal note, if you are in sediment geochemistry, there are very few people who have kind of shaped the field or changed the field the way Bob has. You know, you start reading, there's always an Eller paper to go to. And so, you know, it's both in the way that we think about sediment geochemistry, but also in the way we approach sediment geochemistry, the way we can make analytical measurements, the way really, you know, in many ways, we look at this field that Bob has fundamentally changed. And so, you know, it's really, really great to have him here. And he's an inspiration for many of us who are just starting in the field. And so there's a few sentences I'm going to read to you that come from when he received the American Chemical Society Division Medal, because they put a really, really nice announcement out. And so it starts with Dr. Aller has also been a major driving force in understanding coastal processes and chemical weathering. And then it goes on to say, he has shown that instead of classic steady deposition controlling the resulting sedimentary reaction patterns, these regions are characterized by unsteady mobile muds and so forth, really highlighting you know, the fundamental impact that Bob has had on the field. And he's going to talk a little bit more about the central role that Deltaic systems play in marine biogeochemical cycling. And I hope you ask him many, 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 many questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As those of you who have taken courses with me know, you'll probably have to ask me questions after the time is done here, because I often expand to fill the time available, but I'll try to cut it off early enough that there can be some questions here. So I'm going to talk about, as obviously you can see from the title, the role of deltas in the scheme of things in the ocean. I want to start out by acknowledging the many collaborators I've had over the years on this type of research in many countries. And this is only the tip of the iceberg, quite frankly, because of course, underneath the hood, there's all the people who man the ships and the staff and the techs who make everything we do possible. But these are many of the main actors that I've worked with. And I hope to continue to work with many of them in the future, at least for a little while. So why do we study the coastal ocean? I think everyone here already knows the basic reasons we study the coast. regions, and one is that we get a lot of food from the coastal regions. It's the main region that we catch fish in, and that's where a lot of the sediment that I'm going to talk about in this presentation ends up. 90% of the sediment that enters the ocean ends up in the coastal ocean along the continental margins. But I really want to spend the majority of the time today giving you an intuitive sense of what goes on in deltaic systems and why what goes on is so critical for the chemistry of the entire oceans of the world. And so I'm going to start with a slide that many of you who've taken my courses have seen. This is the boundary condition of river inputs to the oceans, showing by the width of the arrows the amount of sediment that comes in from each of these regions into the sea. And you can see immediately there's a total of about 19 gigatons of sediment per year that enters the ocean, and much of it comes from the Asian and Oceania regions here, where the major rivers of Asia and Southeast Asia and Indonesia enter the oceans. And also, of course, South America with the Amazon playing a huge role. So you can see that there's quite a bit of difference from place to place, and you get the order of magnitude here. Now, this sediment enters the oceans in very different regimes, dominated in part by tides, by waves, and by the rivers themselves. And so the different regions of the coast, which you can see in the color scheme here, the blue wave, brown tide, yeah, not brown tide from around here, but the brown color meaning tidal dominated regions and river dominated regions. So I'm going to talk a lot about the Amazon coast, which is tidally dominated and wind driven as well. Now I'll talk a little bit more as well about Papua New Guinea, which is another tide dominated southern coast of Papua New Guinea here. So one of the things about deltas is that a large part of that sediment that enters the ocean is deposited right off where the river enters the ocean and piles up there, and I'll talk a lot about that as we go along. But a significant part of the sediment that enters the oceans in off large rivers moves along the coastline laterally, one direction or another. Now it's all shown in this schematic going in one direction, but it just depends on which river you're talking about, whether it would go west or east or south or north. But you can see that we're talking about maybe 20% of the sediment that rivers bring in moves along the coast and sticks along the coastline in one form or another. Now, one of the big attractions of looking at deltas biogeochemically is that they are the major depot centers for carbon on Earth, period. Okay. Roughly 45–50% of the carbon that's stored in the ocean is stored in deltaic deposits. And then part of that other major storage is associated with this lateral transport that I just referred to and shelf coastal regions. And these vast maps we look at, the global maps we look at of carbon distributions and sediment, only represent about 5% of the carbon that's stored on Earth. So lots of area out there, but relatively minor importance in the scheme of storage of carbon. So I'm going to talk today as we go along about some of the things that influence the storage of carbon and the remineralization of carbon in different systems and different parts of deltas. So I started this studying deltas back in the late 70s and early 1980s, and I didn't mention in that list of collaborators earlier that my early work on these systems was associated with the Chinese and sort of was supported by NOAA, which in those days supported a lot of global fundamental science at that time. So that's when I started. That's me there. I say young, relatively young man. And there's a number of things you can notice here that there are no women in this picture. The women were not allowed on ships. And if you were to try to go on a Chinese ship nowadays, you wouldn't be allowed if you're American. So I was very lucky to be part of this project and to be able to work in that area. I'm not going to talk about the Changjiang, that's the Yangtze River today, but I wanted to use it as an example. One of the reasons I'm showing you this is because during my lifespan, these systems have changed unbelievably, unbelievably. The Changjiang, the Yangtze River, was the third largest river in the world in 1980 in terms of the sediment it brought to the oceans, and now about 20% of what it used to bring enters the sea, and it's dropped even out of the top 10. And this is sort of the rule of thumb when you look at major river systems. Our activities are not just changing the climate, our activities are changing the entire boundary conditions of the ocean through the input patterns of rivers, the building of dams, the modification of stream flow into the ocean, changing seasonality of the amount. Look over here at Colorado, for instance, one of our own used to be major rivers. Since 1930, it's basically non-existent, bringing anything to the ocean, but it used to be a fairly substantial river. About 1950, when the Mississippi drainage basin was dammed significantly, its delivery to the Gulf of Mexico dropped precipitously and is now much less than it was historically. So that's the rule on Earth nowadays. The water and sediment that enters the ocean is drastically affected by human activity. And there was a recent paper on this reviewed by Jaya Savetsky and others. And you can see from 1950, that's the year here, all these numbers which show the amount of material we move around, you know, bulldozers knocking down forests and buildings and so on, construction patterns, dredging, trawling offshore. They've increased by 10 to 30 times since 1950. So the river that I studied in 1980 is very different now. Okay, and all these rivers are different now. And they're going to continue to change dramatically since some of those figures I showed you earlier, they've already dropped by a couple gigatons per year in terms of the sediment due to continued damming of rivers and so forth. So we're major agents of geologic processes far beyond the climate. The climate is just one aspect of what we're changing. So let me get back to some basic processes associated with deltas. One of the things that differs about deltas is the different drainage basins that rivers are associated with that controls the material that enters the ocean. It's different from place to place. So there are places like the Amazon, which is called the low yield passage margin river, drains a huge drainage basin. And then there are rivers like, for example, around Papua New Guinea, which are high yield, small river drainage basins. They bring a lot of sediment into the ocean, but their drainage basins are less developed than a place like the Amazon. So schematically, what this means is that the kind of material that is brought to the ocean, it really differs from place to place. Reflects the drainage basin processes, the nature of the margin that the rivers are entering. And so, for example, on the North America, on the western coast, the active margin coast, the rivers drain and mountains and quickly run into the sea. And on the passive margin coast, for example, like the Amazon, there are these broad drainage basins where the carbon, for example, and the sediment, nature of the sediment is significantly modified from what it started out with in the rocks to what it ends up with in the oceans. And so in the case of carbon, which I'm going to talk more about, this means that the age of the carbon, which associates with the reactivity of the carbon, differs a lot from place to place. So here's the carbon-14 type of measurement. So modern materials here, if you like fraction modern measurements of carbon-14 as opposed to the capital Del carbon-14 scale, both scales are here for you to look at. And the Amazon, for example, brings in relatively young material to the ocean. It's been modified the drainage basin. So the kind of carbon it brings to the sea is very different, for example, than the Fly River, or the Ferrari River in Papua New Guinea, or Taiwan, rivers which are over here, or New Zealand rivers which are over here, which bring in really old refractory carbon. So the carbon delivered from the continents to the ocean is not the same. It's the same element, but it's not the same kind of material or reactivity of material. And it depends very strongly on the nature of the system that the materials generated in. Now, if you were a graduate student in the late 80s and 1990s, for instance, and you took a course in what controls carbon storage, what controls the efficiency of carbon remineralization from place to place, you would have been forced to memorize this picture. And this is the net accumulation rate of sediment, where it's very low here. This would be like in the central part of the Pacific. Coming over here, Long Island Sound would be right here, for instance. Some of the smaller deltas would be in here. And you'd see this idea that as you increase sediment accumulation rate, that is the rate you pile up sediment, the efficiency of carbon remineralization becomes lower and lower and lower. In other words, you store a greater and greater percentage of the carbon that enters the system in regions of high sedimentation rate versus low sedimentation rate. So out in the middle of the Pacific, about 1% of the carbon is hitting the bottom of the ocean is actually buried there. Whereas if you head toward the near shore regions, we get more and more higher percentages of carbon being stored. Now, there weren't very many deltas. In fact, there were no deltas on this plot. And that's where all the sediment's building up, isn't it? So when we looked at deltas in more detail, we start, here's the part of this pattern I was just showing you. When we start to get out here to the really high sedimentation rates that characterize deltaic regions, we get unbelievable variability. Going from places that look like the deep sea, same percentage of demineralization and, efficiency of burial as the deep sea, to places that really are virtually 100% efficiency of burial here. These are the small mountain rivers, these active margin type systems. These are the Amazonian type situations, which I'll talk more about as we go on. Okay, the other thing, not just carbon reflects the nature of the drainage basin, but also other chemical components, in particular iron phases, differ very greatly from drainage basin to drainage basin. So here's, for example, the Amazon type drainage area, heavily weathered, lots of iron enrichment in the lateritic soil profiles and weathering profiles. Here's a region of Papua New Guinea around Rabaul and New Britain, and you can see this is fresh stuff just coming out of the earth here, not very significantly weathered. And the iron phases that enter the ocean in these tropical river systems tend to be greatly enriched and higher than, for example, the amount of reactive iron oxides from places like the Mississippi or the East Coast of the United States, Cape Hatteras region, for instance, or the West Coast of the United States, the Eel River, for instance. The main thing you should take away is there's a lot of enrichment of iron phases in depending on the nature of the weathering in the drainage basin. Now I'm going to switch a little bit to start talking about what's going on in these different areas of the coastal ocean. What's going on in the sediments? What gets stored and what form does it get stored in, depending on where you are, and what gets returned to the system in terms of different nutrient regeneration patterns or other elements coming in and out of the sediments. And so this is sort of a schematic diagram. Many of you who've taken my courses have already seen it. We have the organic matter I've been talking about comes into the top. This is with depth in the deposit. This is the sediment surface here. There's overlying water up here. And the organic matter reacts and degrades, and at some part of it gets buried. That's what I was talking about before, the efficiency of burial, what ends up here versus what comes up and at the top here. Part of it gets converted into new minerals called oncogenic minerals that are formed in the sediments at the place of deposition. And what drives a lot of this reaction is the uptake of oxidants of different types. Oxygen, you're all familiar with that, I think. And then, of course, you may or may not be familiar with the fact that iron oxides, what I was just talking about, are also major oxidants of organic matter and sediments. Then we have sulfate, and finally CO2 and methanogenesis. So I'm going to talk about, it's really mysterious to you here. I'll try to expand on some of this as we go along here. Now, these reactions I was just referring to occur in different parts of these depositional environments, and in particular deltas. Today's discussion, here's the coastline. So we're going from the coast, perpendicular to the shore, offshore here, deeper water. Here's our shelf break, might be out here. Here's the sediment that's coming in from the rivers I was referring to earlier. The sandier, coarser part of the bedload that is deposited typically along the shore face, shoreline. The muds get offshore and build up into a characteristic deltaic morphology. And these are given different names depending on the literature that you follow. In some part of the literature, this might be called the pro-delta, and this would be called the delta front. I have adopted the cliniform terminology that Chuck Nitrower has promoted over the years. He was a professor here. So this would be called the top set of the delta, and the foreset, and then this is the bottom set. So different parts of these systems, and I'm going to talk about it more to fill you in. So I'll try to take away some of the mystery of what this diagram might be presenting to you. Different parts of the system behave differently, really differently. It's all sediment, yes, but it really behaves very differently. Some parts get piled up and built up and get burrowed by animals. Some parts get dramatically reworked by tidal currents and waves, which I'm going to show you makes all the difference in the world. And then we have the input here from the land, sediment and water. But what's really, really important, and if you don't take anything else away from this talk, what's really important is this kind of system sucks water in from the ocean as bottom water. It flows in and is processed here in the shoreline. So just to show you, I didn't make all this up. It's not just imaginary. Here's a seismic pattern from the Gulf of Papua. Here's shoreline here, heading off into the Coral Sea here. And I think I put this, here's a depth here. So you're going into the topset region here, which is not really shown well on this seismic profile. Here's the sediment water interface in the deeper water here. So we're talking about the 60 meters or so off here, and you can just see the layers of sediment that are built up here as the sediment progrades out. That's the characteristic classic deltaic cliniform of sediment. Now, if you look down on this kind of system as opposed to taking a profile that I was just showing you like this, here's the shoreline, then you get sandy sediments here, you get this top set region here, you get a storage region, that's the foreset region, and then bottom set relative sands offshore. This part is unbelievably critical to the oceans. Okay, now I'm going to talk more about that. But how about a little respite from my thinking about data and processes like that? And so one of the reasons for looking at deltas, particularly in these undeveloped areas, of which there are very, very few left on Earth. Most river systems have been highly modified, as I mentioned before, but in Papua New Guinea, on the south coast, you can go through rivers that are basically have very few indicators of human activity. At nighttime, when the sun goes down, the lights are out. The entire coastline's black. There are no lights to see that are human derived, even though there are humans living in here, but they're not in highly developed, altered centers of population. And so you get these beautiful channels and small rivers. You get the, in this case, black mangroves or nipa palms along the shoreline. But there are people there, and they come out, and with them they'll bring things that they'd like to trade. And this is in the Wame River. And this gentleman came out, got on the boat, and we bought his fruit. And he also let me get on his boat. And I can tell you, it's incredibly unstable, even though you're open pontoons, and I'm terrified. And you can really be impressed with the fact that these people can operate with these kinds of gear. Another thing is, and this is the great Runskill here from Australia. People come out and they want to know what the hell you're doing. Why are you taking mud out of the bottom? Why are you taking water out of our rivers and so on? So you tell them, explain to them what you're up to. And one of the things you find is they're incredibly interested in the science and learning about it, the reasoning behind it. And this is a crew of graduate students with me at the time. You can see how happy they are to be associated with this project, waiting for the next core to be put on this table and processed. And they showed that go get them attitude that you want to see in the students. Actually, that I'm being unfair. They were great, and these three students were really great on the cruises. And this is Katarina Panseca, who some of you may know. She was an undergraduate in my lab, and worked in my lab for several years here, and then went on. She's a professor at Sydney Marathon. So not everybody stays at Stony Brook forever. Move on to bigger things. And one of the things is that in working in the tropics, and this is from the Gulf of Papua, it's not always sunny and nice all the time when you're working offshore. And during certain seasons, obviously it rains quite a bit. There's a lot of water coming down out of the atmosphere in the tropics. And so you often work in more inclement conditions than what I was showing you earlier. This is Bessie Alexandrada's monitoring a multi-core that's going over the side that will take sediment and bring it back on board. And as I mentioned earlier, you get to interact with people in different walks of life. You have students from the University of Papua New Guinea in Port Moresby with us. There's Josie, who's on this cruise, and Bessie. And really, one of the great things about working in these areas is working with the people who live there. Now, this is from the Melville scripts. You can see that they have the same issues that we have in terms of keeping things from rusting. So it's not all just Stony Brook. Here is Bessie again, and Lynn Abramson, who's now president of a small business consortium called, I think, Clean Energy Business Consortium. Some of you may have known her. She's president of that association now, and they're in the lab. Probably reminds you of labs at Stony Brook, because you get your nice metal walls here, so you feel very comfortable on board ship, as you do here. Now back to the planoform and deltas and what goes on in them. I'm not going to I can't spend much time talking about the sand regions, but I will show you, before I go into the muds offshore, tell you about what happens there. Show you that sands can be important. This is from the Gulf of Papua, and it's an uncharted kind of area. And so our ship ran aground, and we were able to get out and walk around the sand there, and the Ferrari River now is over here. So you're looking west, and you can see these huge sandy areas. And we know very little about the role of these sands in the scheme of things. We do know from our experiments here with sands from Long Island, and that's what you're seeing here in these containers, these tubes, core chamber incubators. And what we do here is we look at what goes in and out of sands, and some of what goes out of sands is captured here in these things we call accumulators. And you can see the color here of what's coming in and out of the sands when water moves through the sand. Here it's perhaps shown a little bit better. from sands in which water is actually moved through and to mimic natural processes. A lot of iron comes out of the sediment and is precipitated in these accumulators. So we know these sands are incredibly interactive element in terms of elemental cycling with the overlying water, but we know very little about that. So there you go. Those of you in this business, sands are out there for you. Okay, you can make a whole career studying sands because we know virtually nothing about their role in the scheme of elemental cycling in the oceans. We know some of the things, but I would say to a complete first approximation, very, very little. Now I'm going to go to the Amazon system. This is a beautiful satellite photo, MODIS photo here. And here's the mouth of the Amazon. It's right at the equator. Those of you who know about geomorphology can tell immediately that there's a lot of tidal action here, just from the shape of the mouth of the river. And then about 30% of the Amazon sediment stays here in the subaerial delta. About 40 to 50% comes out here in a prograding cladiform delta, like I described. About 20%, which would be equal to at least the Mississippi River, 15% equal to the Mississippi River, moves up along the coastline here in a form of mudbanks, migrating mudbanks. I'll come back to this, but you can see the green color here, just how productive the water is right along the edge of this system. So now we're going to go into the cladiform delta here off the Amazon, which you were just looking at. And so we have an area here, it's about 50,000 square kilometers. It's a big place here that's characterized by this kind of what I call mobile mud regime. The sediment's kicked up all the time and transported by tidal currents. It's kept mobilized here extensively. And then when it moves out into deeper water, it accumulates into foresand beds out here. There are sands here, but as I said, we know very little about what they do. And the coastline itself is characterized by mangroves, which I'll touch on as we go along. So the sediment, which is stirred up and remobilized and so on and oxidized, keeps a relatively light color, which is the iron oxide minerals here that are kept oxidized because the water, which is oxy, keeps being introduced into the deposit, and the deposit settles down. In this case, it's about a meter length scale. Just to show you, this is not just the Amazon. Here's a core from Papua New Guinea called Papua. Sediment water interface is here. This is depth in the deposit. In this case, only about 30 or 40 centimeters of oxidized sediment can be seen here. And then there's this surface here we call an erosional unconformity here, which represents where the sediment has stopped being eroded and reworked here. But this is all oxidized. And that's deeper and deeper deposit. So one of the things we know is that these kinds of, this is from the kind of core you were just seeing. In fact, this is a profile of thorium-234 from the core you just saw a picture of. And this radionuclide is naturally occurring, has a 24-day half-life. And this large amount of it here tells us that you'll just have to trust me on this, that this sediment was reworked a couple of weeks before we collected it. Okay, so it hadn't been just lying there. It had been exposed to the water intensively for a few weeks before we just got there and collected it. And in another season at the same spot, the sediment has been sitting there quiescent, and the thorium-234 penetration and the amount of it's much less. So the sediment here is sitting, and here it's been reworked. And it's just a very repetitive process here that's taking place. In this case, it's driven by winds. I put this little insert here. These are the wind forcing on the Gulf of Papua, and during the southeast trades, that's the red part here, you get sustained winds of 25 to 30 knots. So it's pretty grim working out there during that period. And during the monsoon, it's more quiescent. Okay, on the Amazon, these layers I was just showing you, these oxidized layers can be really thick, meters thick. And so here's our top set region. Here's a contour showing you a couple meters of sediment, where the lead-210 profile in that sediment, lead-210 is a 22-year half-life, is just homogenized. It's because the sediment's just being reworked physically so frequently, it stays homogenized with respect to radio tracers. Now, hang in there a little bit. One of the ways we look at reactions in sediments, and biogeochemically driven reactions in sediments, is in terms of their redox reaction chemistry. And it's one of the central organizing ideas that we have is that there's a sequence of utilization of oxidants in sediments during carbon decomposition that goes over and over again down this scheme of oxidant utilization in the sediments. Now, one of the differences between the top set and this kind of scheme is that this frequent reworking of sediments sets this pattern of progression reactions into a repetitive pattern of change of reaction dominance. And so, in fact, you can get stuck in certain parts of this progression and maintain chemical conditions like one of the states of this normal regression. So you just get stuck. And in this case, for Amazon top set regions, you're stuck in ferruginous conditions and iron remineralization. So you can get 10 minutes after a disturbance, or maybe a few days after a disturbance, you can get denitrification and oxygen utilization. And then for months afterwards, you can be stuck in a state of reaction conditions that's dominated by iron remineralization. And so when you look at these systems, like the Amazon, with depth in the deposit, here, this is in hundreds of centimeters, here, tens of centimeters depth here on the Amazon coast, down farther in the system in French Guiana, tens of centimeters, like a meter. You can see that these concentrations of iron, which are shown here in micromolar, in the pore water are really, really high. And now, if you were a biogeochemist looking at this, not knowing anything about the dynamics here, you'd look at this and you'd say, oh, this is like the deep sea. Lots of, you get iron or maybe deep water regions, it's hardly any carbon being remineralized here. It's stuck in the iron stage of decomposition because there's not much reductant. You'd be wrong. Because what's causing this is this dynamic reworking of the deposits that keeps the system stuck in this reaction stage. Now, one of the things I want to mention here that makes these areas so critical is that because iron is a carrier phase for lots of elements that are concentrated in the iron oxide phases during weathering on land, when this stuff comes into the sea, all the elements that have been tied in with iron on land start to get released. So, for example, here is a profile showing kind of iron profile I was showing you a minute ago. Depth of the deposit, a couple hundred centimeters depth. And then here's arsenic, dissolved arsenic in the pore water. Those of you who know about arsenic know that a couple micromoles of arsenic in solution is unbelievably high. It's like a worst case polluted factory on the east coast of the US or the Gulf Coast of the US. That's the kind of level of dissolved arsenic you would expect, but it's there naturally. And it's there because it's concentrated by weathering processes on land. Then when the iron is reduced in the ocean, the arsenic's released. Similarly, iodine shows the same kind of pattern. Iodine is normally a component of organic matter and is remineralized like nitrogen or phosphorus. And you'd expect particular ratios of iodine to nitrogen, for example. And the Redfield ratio of iodine to nitrogen is about 0.7 millimoles per mole nitrogen. But out on the Amazon, the iodine is screamingly high, hundreds of times higher than you'd expect for just remineralization of nitrogen and organic matter. And it tracks coherently a metalloid like boron, which is itself concentrated in iron oxides on land. Then when we look at something like uranium, which is an actinide element, this is the uranium pore water profile. It's about 5 times higher than seawater, so there's an enrichment of dissolved uranium. And here is a critical indicator that this is the uranium activity ratio of 234 to 238. You don't need to know the exact value or origin of this, except that if it were dominated by seawater uranium, it would have a value of about 1.15. And in fact, you can see it has a value of 1.5. That means this uranium came from land. Okay. So land processes coupled with biogeochemical processes in the ocean to influence a huge array of elements, disproportionately to what you'd ever expect if you weren't attuned to how they behaved in the weathering process. Now, another characteristic of these systems which you should recognize or appreciate is that when you look at the benthic communities that are in these sediments, the red here is the microbial biomass in grams carbon per meter squared. The blue here is macrofaunal biomass. And one of the things you can see at a glance, these are temperate type stations, for example, off Cape Hatteras. Very typical, lots of burrowing macrofauna. But these top set areas I've been describing to you lack macrofauna. They're like big microbial reactors. So now I want to say a few things. I know I'm not going to get that all done with what I thought. I didn't kind of go off on different things, but I did. Part of the material, as I said, that leaves the Amazon goes up along the coast in the form of mud banks. And these are about 60 kilometers long, and they prograde along the coastline at about 3 to 4 kilometers a year. And if you look out along the coast, here's a small river coming in here. You see these massive amounts of mud just progressing past the coast here. And then part of it's stabilized in mangrove forests. And if you look down on one of these mud banks, it has these kinds of sections of it. The offshore patterns are characterized by the same kind of conditions I described for the Amazon topset. Mobile muds moving along here, highly oxidized. Part of that material gets accreted to the shore face, colonized rapidly by mangroves, and then as this pile of mud progresses along the coast, the backside's eroded, and all the mangrove forests are destroyed. All the mud here is washed into this part of the system. That's the way it looks when the tide's out. Tens of kilometers of mud, featureless mud. Offshore. Here's one of my students, Isaac Holmesman. You can see how soft this mud is because it's up to his armpits. And it can be dangerous if you're not prepared to, for it. So schematically, this is the way I like to think about this kind of system. Here's the Amazon bringing in sediment here. Here you got your proximal delta that I've talked about. There's a stream of mud that moves along. It's what I call the outer mobile band. Part of it is stabilized here on the average. So this takes away the features of the individual mud banks, stabilized and colonized, and then it's stabilized for periods of about 20 to 30 years. So here's lead-210 in some of those offshore muds of the mud bank. Here's lead-210 in the mangrove regions. And here's the activity of that lead-210. You can see it's in the mangroves, it's roughly half the activity of it is offshore. That means the mangroves are stabilized for 20, 30 years, about a half-life of lead-210. They're rapidly colonized. It's the kind of bare mud I was showing you. After it's stabilized for a few months, you get pioneer mangroves. They grow a couple meters. They grow about a meter a year or more. And so after 4 years or so of stabilized conditions, you have 10-meter tall mangrove trees, and they reach about 30 meters in height before they are eroded, as I'm going to show you. I'm in trouble. One of the ways we looked at when the mud is stabilized, as I just showed you, it's rapidly colonized by mangroves and forests. It's also rapidly colonized by macrofauna, which cannot survive in these offshore mobile mud regions. But as soon as the mud stabilized, in come the animals, and they start burrowing like crazy. Here's a mud flat. Some great pictures by Emma Michaud and co-workers Nick and others took with drones and mapped out the openings of burrows of crabs, euca species that build subterranean galleries, burrow galleries, very complex subterranean biogenic structures that are filled with water and irrigated. And there's a huge nutrient flux out of these burrows, but you can count using drone and imagery, you can count burrows and where the larger ones are and estimate the subsurface volume associated with them. And so during low tide, things that are generated in the sediments like iodine, arsenic, ammonium, phosphate, all of these things associated with iron reduction and carbon remineralization build up in the burrow water. So this is ammonium in the burrow water here as a function of time of low tide. In other words, when the water is removed from the flat and the burrow is just sitting there filled with water, ammonium builds up and these other reactants build up. Then when the tide comes in, all of this stuff is flushed out of the burrows and moved toward the mangroves. So these burrows are major features of exchange of elements in these systems. Now, on the backside of these migrating mud banks, the mangrove forests, which grew rapidly, as you just saw, get destroyed and eroded. This is normal and natural. Okay? And all that carbon material that's there is remineralized. And that's me a few years ago. And my point is, I have this container filled with the mobile mud, but all those pictures I was just showing you, like the burrow areas, they're gone. They don't exist anymore. They've been eroded, turned into mobile mud, and moved downstream. And when that migration takes place, carbon is remineralized all along the way. So here's the carbon coming in the Amazon River with a normalized carbon per meter squared of particle surface of about 0.7 on this scale, 0.7 milligrams carbon per meter squared comes in at this value. As it moves down the coast toward French Guiana in the mud stream, the carbon is depleted, remineralized. And this particular graph is a model that shows you what's lost as the carbon's remineralized. What's the isotopic value of that carbon? And you can see it's minus 27, minus 28. That means it's mangrove carbon. It's that refractory carbon. So as the carbon moves down the coast, it's depleted and the most refractory components are lost. Now I put here a couple of points. These are from the Amazon fan in deep water. These are from low stand conditions along this coastline. When the water of the ocean no longer covered reacting sediments like the top set of the delta. The sediment just went into deep water and got buried. You can see how much carbon, how much more carbon is being buried during low stand of the sea level in this system than presently today. At least twice as much, right? So the Amazon low stand tells us that when you bypass these coastal dynamic environments, you get a lot more carbon storage. Now, all along the way, this is another one of these isotopic diagrams. Carbon 14 here, older material will be down here, and younger material up here, and carbon 13, more terrestrial here, more marine here. And this is the CO2 carbon isotopic composition of pore water, showing you what's being burned off by bacteria during these processes. This is the solid sediment mixtures of all different carbon pools. And this is showing you that all along the way, we are removing refractory old carbon, but we're also generating lots of new carbon. I'm going to take a couple more minutes. Obviously, I'm not going to get done. So one of the points I want to make to you is that this high productivity water off here is always being sucked in shore. You can see these advective features, these eddies of high fresh carbon features moving into this turbid nearshore water. So there's onshore exchange that you can see visually. There's also offshore exchange here. This is the coast of French Guiana. These are CWIS maps of Port Fillet. You can see moving off into the ocean. So there's export and import taking place in these systems. We can get a sense of the import using, again, lead-210. These are some fantastic maps showing you the total inventory of lead-210 on the shelf here, the Amazon shelf, that is dictated by the sucking shoreward of ocean-derived material. The lead-210 that could come from the atmosphere of the river is of order 10 on this scale, and you can see these are 500,000. So in fact, about 10 times the volume of Amazon river water that moves into the ocean, about 10 times of that water is moved on shore, bringing with it plankton and other things that are sucked into that topset reactor that I described. And the same thing happens in the Gulf of Papua. That's what these diagrams show you, that there's a lot of mass transport of bottom water toward shore and extraction of elements along the shoreline. So I can't really go into the great detail here, but obviously the bottom line is that there's tremendous amount of shoreward movement of material. And there are other systems where you can see this. Here's the Wadi Delta in Myanmar, here in Burma, and these large river systems down in trouble. They come into a place called the Gulf of Montalban, and it's another one of these tidally dominated shore coastal environments, and all that fresh marine algal material is sucked in here and mixed with terrestrial stuff and burned off. And so I refer to these deltaic systems as the global incineration zone for carbon. You can see the amount of carbon here using that unit of carbon per surface area in deltas. These incredibly productive places with extreme releases of CO2. They have the same amount of carbon in the sediment as the middle of the Pacific. Unbelievable. And that's because of this incineration that's taking place due to sedimentary dynamics. Okay, so obviously I didn't get, yeah, lots more. That's, you all know my thing, my problem. It's exciting. There's lots going on here. I want to end with the fact that one of the big effects of deltas in the global scheme of elemental cycling is that they are centers of what's called reverse weathering. In other words, the reactions on land that are driving things into the sea that we call weathering, rocks, CO2, sucking down CO2 out of the atmosphere, producing all the stuff in the rivers, going into the sea, get reversed in the ocean. The same reactions that are driving what we call forward weathering reactions now, taking material into the sea, they get reversed in the ocean and driven backwards to form new clays, release CO2, change the acid-base dynamics of the ocean. So obviously, sorry about that, but I can't talk about those reactions here today. It's another talk, I guess. But here are some main summary conclusions I'd like you to take away and from what I was talking about. and the importance of the coastal ocean and deltaic systems in particular in driving elemental cycling in the entire global ocean. Thank you. One question, maybe?
So you mentioned that when the rivers flow in deep water, you get a lot more carbon storage. How much does that kind of feedback contribute to the glacial interglacial transitions? Or is it known?
It's not really known. What is known is that there is more carbon storage in along the margins of the ocean during low stand, sea level low stand. Now, the problem is that's telling you what that storage center is and the efficiency of that storage center, but you don't know what the productivity in the ocean is during that time, nor do you know what the productivity of the terrestrial areas are during that time. So you can only know that part, but there's more storage than you would otherwise get when you bypass these shelf reactor systems.
Actually, the one slide you should have shown.
That's why I didn't want her to introduce me.
Showing you that there are a lot of processes that are affecting that are going on in the mud that are affecting the atmosphere. This John Mack on one of the flats off the Amazon,
Yeah.
With chambers where he was looking at
Yeah. He still hasn't forgiven us for leaving him at low tide.
6 hours later.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Now, you drop people off and then the water leaves and you have those incredible mud deposits. You can't get back to the people you've dropped off until the tide comes back in.
So what proportion of total carbon storage can be attributed to these deltaic centers? And if there's more and more damming going on, not in the Amazon, but many others, does that matter?
Yeah, it does. About half of carbon storage in the ocean is in the deltas.
Okay,
About half. And now, when you alter all these processes I talked about, either by not releasing water or changing the way water runs in or changing coastal dynamics, you alter the efficiency of the carbon remineralization processes, as well as alter the storage. So a lot of the carbon that would otherwise come into the sea and be stored in deltas will be caught behind dams. So that's where it'll end up, and more of it actually will be stored than would have been burned off if it did go into the ocean.
and is there any, just a follow-up question, is there any human systemic distribution around the planet that makes human occupation and damming of these of various rivers? Are those rivers more suppliers of carbon, or are they in places like the Mississippi where maybe it's less?
Less.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe in effect, that won't be such a big deal, that the damming in the global scheme of things.
Well, where it is an effect is that the coastal productivity starts to be altered. So the fisheries, for example, they slowly run down because you don't get the kind of recycling that you did before. So you're altering the whole system. I can't tell you exactly what'll happen. I wish I could, but it will change. There'll be less remineralization, less nutrient cycling, and lower productivity for sure in the coastal region.
Okay, we're out of
Thanks.
time.
Yep. Right.